Edward Monroe sat in one of the large rooms of his mansion, gazing out the window at the impeccably manicured gardens. Outside, the summer sun illuminated every leaf, every flower, but inside, he felt wrapped in a cold, suffocating darkness. The mansion where he lived was his family's inheritance, a vast estate in Naperville, but the luxury, comfort, and tranquility no longer filled the emptiness he felt. At 35, Edward was one of the most successful businessmen in Chicago. Heir to a fortune his family had built over generations, he was surrounded by luxuries and people who always admired him, but he knew that for most, what they admired was his money. He had always been the Monroe heir, and that identity shaped the way the world interacted with him. He clearly remembered the countless parties, social events, and charity dinners he attended, and at each one, he saw the same smiles, heard the same empty words. People seemed to care only about what he had, not who he was. His most recent romantic disappointment, just a few weeks earlier, was the final straw. He had been betrayed by someone who claimed to love him, but in the end, was only interested in the lifestyle he provided. He wondered, was it possible for someone to love him for who he was, not for what he possessed? That's when, on that sunny morning, a daring idea took hold of his mind, an idea that seemed ridiculous at first. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He had recently read about a charity contest that would be held in Naperville. The event, which aimed to crown the Queen of Solidarity, sought to highlight women involved in social causes who in some way represented the values of empathy and generosity. The contest, although it had an aura of glamour and was surrounded by a beauty pageant atmosphere, actually had a real philanthropic motive. Most of the participants were women involved in social projects, and the prize would be donated to the cause supported by the winner. Edward saw an opportunity. He would participate, but not as the millionaire Edward Monroe. He would disguise himself as someone completely different, a homeless man. This was the only way to ensure that any connection that emerged would be genuine. He could observe how the participants would treat him without the influence of his status. It would be a transformative experience, both for him and for those he met. "Are you really going to do this, Edward?" The deep voice of James Brown, his driver and confidant, interrupted his thoughts. James was standing by the door, watching the young businessman with concern. He had worked for the Monroe family for decades, and to him, Edward was almost like a son. "Disguising yourself as a homeless man might be more dangerous than it seems." Edward took a deep breath before responding. He knew his plan was risky, but he also knew he could no longer endure the empty life he was leading. "James, I need this," he replied, meeting his driver's paternal gaze. "I need to find someone who sees me beyond the money. I can't keep living surrounded by lies and superficialities. If this means disguising myself, then that's what I'll do." James sighed, rubbing his chin as he reflected. He knew Edward was determined, and as always, his role was to support him. But even so, the veteran driver couldn't help but worry. "And what's going to happen when you meet someone, Edward? When you realize she might be the right person? Are you going to keep the lie going until the end?" James's voice had a tone of caution, and the question echoed in Edward's mind. He hadn't yet thought about the final consequence of his decision. What would he do if he really fell for someone while pretending to be someone else? How would he reveal his true identity? I don't know yet, James," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But one step at a time. First, I need to see how these people react to character, not to a bank account." James shook his head, resigned, but with a touch of pride at Edward's courage in attempting something so radical. "Very well, sir. If that's your plan, I'll be here to help." And so the plan was set in motion. Edward would step away from the life of luxury and glamour for a few days, hiding his true identity. To the outside world, he would be a simple homeless man, looking for a fresh start, without anyone knowing he was actually the millionaire Edward Monroe. Meanwhile, on the other side of Naperville, Claire Adams, the dedicated nurse, was in her small apartment reviewing the documents for her contest application. The NGO where she worked, Hope Shelter, was facing financial difficulties, and the opportunity to participate in an event that could bring not only visibility, but also significant donations was something she couldn't ignore. She didn't like the idea of pageants or beauty contests, but she knew that sometimes sacrifices were necessary for the greater good. Claire thought about what the event would be like, how those lights and spotlights didn't reflect the reality she lived daily alongside those. She sighed, knowing the road ahead would be challenging. But in the end, it would be worth it if she could help the homeless find a chance to start over. The streets of Naperville looked different to Edward, now that he was in disguise. Dressed in worn-out clothes and carrying a battered sleeping bag, he could feel the stares of people passing by. They were no longer admiring or respectful glances like those he was accustomed to in his life of luxury, but rather looks of indifference or even disdain. This contrast hit him like an avalanche. He realized how much appearances shaped people's reactions, something he had never experienced in his privileged life. Edward chose a bench in Naperville's Central Park to spend his night. During the day, he wandered the streets, trying to blend in with the homeless population. The city, usually so vibrant and full of life, now appeared in a different light, with forgotten alleys and people overlooked by society. It was a world he had never imagined, but one he was now living in. Meanwhile, Claire was busy at Hope Shelter, the NGO where she worked as a nurse. Her day began as usual, registering new homeless arrivals, distributing meals, and caring for the most vulnerable. Although the work was hard and often emotionally draining, Claire felt fulfilled. She knew that even the smallest gesture of help could make a difference in someone's life. That afternoon, while organizing medical supplies, Claire received a call confirming her entry into the charity beauty contest. After hanging up, she felt an odd discomfort. The event was the opposite of everything she stood for. Competing for something based on appearance didn't make sense to her, but Claire knew that if she won, the shelter could receive enough donations to keep running for months, providing support to those who needed it most. So, despite her reservations, she resolved to do whatever it took to win. The next morning, as she walked toward the shelter, Claire noticed a man sitting on a park bench. He looked defeated, his head bowed and his hands resting in his lap. His brown hair was disheveled, and his beard, which appeared to have grown for weeks, gave him an even more worn-out look. It was Edward, of course, but she didn't know that. To Claire, he was just another homeless person in need of help. She approached cautiously, hesitant to break his silence. Her compassionate gaze and caretaker's instinct pushed her to do something. With a gentle smile, she knelt beside the bench. "Hi," she said softly. "Are you hungry? We have a shelter nearby where we serve meals every day. Would you like to come?" Edward looked up, surprised. He hadn't expected anyone to approach him, much less a young woman radiating so much empathy. His clear eyes met Claire's, and for a moment he was speechless. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, at least not the kind that wasn't tied to his money or power. Now, however, he was just an ordinary man in her eyes. Edward hesitated, still adjusting to his new identity. "Yes, I think I could go." Claire's smile widened, relieved that he accepted her offer. She stood and extended her hand, a gesture that took Edward by surprise. He looked at her hand for a moment before taking it and standing up from the bench. Claire noticed how different he seemed from the others she helped daily. There was something in his eyes, a depth she couldn't quite decipher. Walking side by side, they made their way to Hope Shelter. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but rather contemplative. Claire, always sensitive to the emotional states of others, respected Edward's space, not pressing him to speak. When they arrived at the shelter, she led him to the kitchen where volunteers were serving a simple but nutritious lunch. "You can sit here, and I'll get a plate for you," Claire said, pointing to a table. Edward nodded and sat in the corner of the room, watching the activity around him. He had never been in a place like this. Despite all the charity work his family did, he had rarely been involved directly. Seeing the dedication of the people, especially Claire, moved him in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't doing this for fame or recognition. Her motivation was genuine, something he hadn't seen in a long time in the social circles he belonged to. A few minutes later, Claire returned with a plate of soup and bread. She placed it in front of Edward, who thanked her with a shy smile. She watched as he began to eat, feeling a slight curiosity growing within her. There was something about Edward that caught her attention. Perhaps it was the way he seemed out of place, as if he didn't quite belong in that environment. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to start a conversation without being intrusive. Edward hesitated for a second before responding, trying to maintain his disguise. Steve Howard." He almost laughed at himself for coming up with the name so quickly, but Claire didn't seem to notice the hesitation. "Nice to meet you, Steve. I'm Claire," she said naturally. "If you need anything else or just want to talk, I'll be around, okay?" Edward nodded, watching as she walked away to help others at the shelter. He stayed there for a while longer, thinking about Claire's kindness. She had no idea who he really was, didn't know his true identity, yet she treated him with a compassion he rarely experienced in his life as a millionaire. In the days that followed, Edward continued to visit the shelter. Each day, he and Claire exchanged more words, small conversations about life, about the shelter, and slowly, a genuine connection began to form. Claire remained intrigued by Steve, unaware that he was much more complex than he appeared. She admired his quietness, the the way he listened intently, and how, despite being homeless, he carried a certain dignity that wasn't easy to find. On the other hand, Edward was facing a challenge. With each conversation, he felt closer to Claire, but at the same time, he knew he was trapped in a lie. He wanted to tell her the truth, but the fear of losing her trust kept him silent. The charity beauty contest was fast approaching, and as Claire prepared for the event, Edward was about to face one of the greatest dilemmas of his life. With the charity beauty contest just days away, the atmosphere at Hope Shelter was more hectic than usual. Claire remained torn between her responsibility to the event and the discomfort she felt about participating in something that didn't reflect her values. The contest was a huge opportunity for the shelter, but at the same time she questioned whether she was straying too far from her principles. Meanwhile, Edward, still under the guise of Steve, was wrestling with his own internal conflict. Every day spent by Claire's side brought him closer to her, and the fear of losing her trust was growing. He knew the contest would be the stage for major revelation. His plan to disguise himself was becoming unsustainable, especially now that his feelings for Claire were stronger than ever. One afternoon, just days before the contest, Edward found Claire at the shelter. She was helping to organize a supply delivery, but she seemed more troubled than usual. Her eyes were distant, and the serene expression he admired was replaced by a tension he couldn't ignore. "Claire, is everything okay?" Edward asked, approaching her carefully. She sighed, wiping her hands on a cloth before sitting down in one of the small chairs in the volunteer room. "It's the contest," she replied, shaking her head. "I'm feeling more and more uncomfortable about it. It's not the kind of thing I'd want to do, but the shelter needs the money, the donations. I feel like I'm betraying who I am by participating in something so superficial." Edward felt a pang of guilt hearing this. Claire was right, and he knew that the event seemed to contradict everything she stood for. The fact that she was willing to sacrifice her values for something greater, like the well-being of the needy, only made him admire her more. But a part of him was anxious. If Claire knew who he really was and the circumstances behind his presence at the shelter, would she still see him the same way? "I understand why you feel that way," he said, carefully choosing his words. "But you're doing it for the right reasons. I can't imagine how many lives will be impacted if the shelter gets the support it needs. Sometimes we have to make temporary sacrifices for a greater good." Claire looked at him and managed a soft smile. "You're right. I guess I'm just letting my insecurities get the best of me. It's not just the contest." She hesitated for a moment, looking directly at him. "It's you too, Steve. Since we met, I've felt like there's something about you I can't quite understand. Something you're not telling me." Edward's heart raced. Claire was getting closer and closer to the truth. He knew he couldn't keep hiding his identity, but the idea of revealing it now, so close to the contest, terrified him. "Claire, Edward began, feeling the weight of his own words. But before he could continue, Lisa Ford appeared at the door, interrupting the moment. "Claire!" Lisa exclaimed with an exaggerated smile. "I'm so glad I found you here. Are you ready for the big event? I thought maybe we could plan something together before the contest. You know, a little personal marketing never hurts." Claire forced a smile in response, but Edward could see the discomfort in her eyes. Lisa was the opposite of everything Claire stood for, and her presence in that moment only seemed to worsen the tension Claire was already feeling. "Oh, hi, Steve," Lisa said, turning to Edward with a falsely friendly expression. "How are you? I hope you enjoyed that snack I gave you the other day. It was a pleasure to help." Edward nodded, trying to avoid a prolonged interaction. He already knew that Lisa saw him as nothing more than a marketing opportunity, and the way she spoke to him now only reinforced that. "Well, I'll leave you two to talk," Lisa said with a mysterious smile. "Claire, let me know if you want to coordinate something before the show. It's going to be quite the event." When Lisa left, silence once again filled the space between Edward and Claire. He felt he needed to say something, to tell the truth, but once again he lacked the courage. In the following days, Claire focused on the contest. She prepared as best she could, but the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders was immense. She knew that more than the crown or the title, the real victory would be securing the future of the shelter and the people who depended on it. Throughout the process, Edward continued to frequent the shelter, watching Claire's journey from a distance and trying to find the right moment to tell her the truth. Finally, the day of the contest arrived. The event hall was packed. Bright lights, red carpets, and immaculate floral arrangements gave the room an air of glamour that sharply contrasted with the charitable purpose of the event. The contestants, all dressed beautifully, waited anxiously for the show to begin. For Claire, it felt Sue. She felt out of place, as if she were living a strange dream far from the reality she knew. Backstage, Claire adjusted her simple dress, more concerned about what the event represented for the shelter than her appearance. As she prepared, a wave of emotions washed over her. Her thoughts drifted to Steve. He had promised to be at the event, and for some reason, his presence seemed more important to her than anything else in that moment. Indeed, Edward was there, but not as Steve. In the grand hall, he observed everything from a distance, now dressed as the millionaire he truly was. James, his loyal driver and confidant, stood beside him, watching the young man with concern. "Mr. Monroe, are you sure this is a good idea?" James asked, using the surname Edward rarely heard anymore, except when he was in the middle of his life as a businessman. Revealing your true identity here could cause a lot of confusion. Edward took a deep breath, looking toward the stage where Claire would soon appear. He knew he had to do this, that he couldn't live in the lie any longer. Not after everything he had seen and felt. "I don't have a choice, James," he replied, his voice low but determined. "I need to be honest with her. I can't let her find out from someone else." James nodded, respecting the young man's decision but worried about the potential consequences. The event began, with the contestants being called one by one to the stage. The host, with an enthusiastic voice, announced the women and their charitable causes. When Claire's name was called, the audience applauded, but Edward noticed something different. For her, this moment wasn't about parading or showing off a beautiful dress. Claire was there for something much bigger, and that made her unique. As Claire made her entrance, the applause echoed through the hall. But Edward felt his heart racing. He knew that after the pageant, he would have to face the truth and deal with the consequences of his action. The contest stage would become the setting for the most important revelation of his life. The hall glittered with bright lights, reflecting off the shimmering gowns of the contestants. For everyone in attendance, the event was a night of glamour and charity. But for Claire and Edward, it represented something far more complicated. Claire, despite maintaining a calm smile, was in turmoil. She walked across the stage, but her mind wandered. She thought of Steve, of the quiet ease he always showed that concealed something deeper. As she moved through the crowd, she searched the audience for any sign of him. She wanted him to be there, as he had promised. On the other side of the room, Edward, now without his disguise as Steve, watched Claire with a mixture of admiration and guilt. He knew he was on the verge of losing everything he had built with her if he didn't reveal the truth. The weight of that decision pressed down on him, and he felt there was no turning back. He had to be honest, no matter how painful it might be. As Claire finished her walk, she retreated backstage, feeling a wave of relief. She was glad to be done with that part of the event, but the anxiety of what was to come still gnawed at her. However, before she could begin to relax, one of the event organizers approached her. "Claire, someone's waiting for you in the dressing room," he said, his expression serious. Claire frowned, puzzled. She wasn't expecting anyone specific, apart from a few friends from the shelter who were at the event to support her. Feeling a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, she made her way to the dressing room. When she opened the door, her heart leapt. There stood Edward, dressed in an elegant suit, looking completely different from the man she knew as Steve. She froze in place, confused and in disbelief. "Edward?" The name escaped her lips before she could even process what was happening. She recognized him almost instantly, not just by his appearance, but because, over the past few days, something inside her had already suspected that Steve was hiding much more than he let on. Edward took a deep breath, feeling Claire's gaze pierce through him. The moment he had dreaded for so long had finally arrived. "Claire, I need to tell you the truth," he began, his voice low but filled with emotion. "My name isn't Steve Howard. My name is Edward Monroe, and I'm the heir to the Monroe family. I'm not homeless. I never was." The silence that followed was like a cold wave washing over the room. Claire stood there, her heart racing, trying to process what she had just heard. Her mind was a storm of thoughts, and for a moment, she couldn't believe it. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You lied to me this whole time? You pretended to be someone else?" Edward felt the crushing weight of guilt, but he knew he couldn't stop now. "Yes, I lied," he admitted, each word hurting him more than the last. "When I disguised myself, the idea was to find someone who knew me for who I am, not for my money. I was tired of being treated like a status symbol, of being seen only as a millionaire. I wanted to find out who really cared, who could see beyond appearances. That's how I ended up at the shelter. And that's how I met you." Claire took a step back, trying to absorb everything. She had always known there was something different about Steve, but she never imagined he was lying to her. And while his motivations might have been understandable, it didn't justify the deception. "You thought pretending to be homeless would make it easier for me to like you?" Claire asked, her frustration and disappointment evident in her voice. "I trusted you, Steve. Edward, or whoever you are. You were at the shelter, you saw how people struggle every day, and yet you used that as part of some game for your own purposes. Edward shook his head, desperate for her to understand. It wasn't a game, Claire. I never meant to hurt you. At first, I just wanted to see how people would react to someone without money or status. But then things changed. I met you. And every day, I fell more in love with your kindness, your strength, your dedication to others. None of that was fake. Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with pain. She felt betrayed, as though everything she had believed about him had been torn apart in an instant. And yet she couldn't deny the connection she had felt with him as Steve, on a deeper level. You should have trusted me from the beginning, she said, her voice quieter now, as if the emotional exhaustion was taking over. How am I supposed to trust you now? Edward had no easy answers. He knew he had ruined everything, but he also knew that the feelings he had developed for Claire were real. He wasn't ready to give up without a fight. I know I messed up, Claire, and I understand if you never want to talk to me again, but I couldn't keep living this lie. I needed to be honest with you, even if it meant losing everything. Claire took a deep breath, emotions swirling inside her. She wanted to walk away, to leave behind the man who had lied to her, but something held her back. Deep down, she knew Edward wasn't a bad person. He had made poor choices, but the reasons behind them weren't shallow. He was trying to find something genuine in a world full of appearances and self-interest. Still, it didn't change the fact that he had deceived her. I need time, she finally said. I don't know how to feel about all this right now. I need to think. Edward nodded, respecting her decision. Of course, I understand. I just hope one day you can forgive me. And with that, he turned and left, leaving Claire alone in the dressing room, lost in her own thought. The rest of the night passed in a blur for Claire. The contest continued, and when the time came for the winner to be announced, she barely paid attention. When her name was called as the Queen of Solidarity, she forced a smile and stepped onto the stage, accepting the crown with a sense of emptiness. The bright lights, the applause, and all the event's glamour felt distant and unreal now. All she wanted was clarity amidst the chaos of her emotions. As the crowd celebrated, Edward watched from afar. He had shattered Claire's trust, and he knew that despite his feelings, the road to rebuilding that trust would be long and uncertain. In the days following the event, Claire distanced herself from everything. She needed time to think, to reflect on what she felt for Edward, or Steve as she had known him. The Hope Shelter was now secure, with the donation guaranteed by the contest, but her heart remained divided. She knew Edward wasn't a bad man, but the pain of his betrayal was still too fresh. On the other hand, Edward, now stripped of his disguises, was determined to win back Claire's trust, fully aware that the path ahead would be arduous and uncertain. The days following the charity contest were difficult for Claire. Although Hope Shelter was finally secure thanks to her victory, her heart remained unsettled. Every time she tried to focus on her work, thoughts of Edward, or Steve, as she still thought of him, came rushing back. The revelation weighed on her like a silent storm, and she couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. Despite this, something within her kept Edward in her thoughts. The moments they shared, the genuine conversations, remained untouched by the lie. Beneath the deception, there had been truth, and it was this contradiction that left her so confused. A week after the contest, Claire was at the shelter, cleaning and organizing supplies, when she heard a soft knock at the door. When she opened it, there stood Edward. He looked different now, without Steve's disguise, but the look in his eyes was the same, a man seeking redemption. Claire, I know you don't want to see me, and I don't want to force anything, he began, his voice calm but filled with sincerity. I just came to tell you, I'm leaving for a while. I'll give you the space you need, but before I go, I wanted you to know that everything I felt for you was real. I never meant to hurt you. Claire stood there for a moment, absorbing his words. Part of her felt relieved that he was stepping back, but another part, deeper down, fought against it. She knew her feelings for him were real, even if everything had started with a lie. Will you come back? She asked, the question slipping from her lips before she could stop herself. Edward smiled, a small, almost sad smile. I'll come back if you want me to, he replied, but I won't push. With that, he turned to leave. But before he could take more than a few steps, Claire called out to him. Edward, wait! Her voice was softer than she had expected. When he turned around, her eyes were fixed on his. I don't know how to feel about all of this yet, but part of me wants to believe you were trying to be honest in the end. I just don't understand why you lied for so long. Edward sighed, knowing he owed her a deeper explanation. In the beginning, Claire, it was just an attempt to escape the life I've always had, he explained, stepping closer. I was surrounded by people who only saw me for my money. All I wanted was a chance to be seen for who I really am, without the label society puts on me. When I met you, you were different from anyone I'd ever encountered. But as I realized I was falling for you, the fear of losing your trust paralyzed me. I should have told you the truth from the start, but I was scared that if you knew, you'd never look at me the same way again. Claire crossed her arms, thoughtful. His words made sense, but the hurt still lingered. She knew Edward had been fighting against the same prejudices he saw in others. Disguising himself as a homeless man to find someone who loved him for who he truly was had been extreme, but she understood the reason behind it. Still, the fear of trusting him remained strong. I need to know if you really understand what you did, Edward, she said, her voice firm. It wasn't just a lie. You used a vulnerable situation, a shelter that deals with people who are genuinely struggling to survive. This is serious. You entered this world without fully grasping what it meant. I know, Edward replied, his voice filled with regret. And I'll never fully forgive myself for that. But I'm here, ready to do whatever it takes to make things right. I don't expect you to forgive me immediately, but I want to show you that I'm more than the bad decisions I've made. Claire studied him for a moment. The man standing in front of her wasn't the arrogant millionaire she might have imagined. He was vulnerable, sincere, and willing to atone. Despite the disappointment she felt, she couldn't ignore the fact that he was trying to change. I can't just forgive you overnight, Claire said, her voice softening. But if you're willing to be honest from now on, maybe we can find a way forward. One step at a time. Edward nodded, grateful for the small chance she was giving him. He knew the road to regaining her trust would be long, but this opportunity, however small, meant everything to him. I'll do whatever it takes, Claire, he promised, his eyes filled with determination. One step at a time, like you said. In the days that followed, Edward began helping more at the shelter, this time as himself, without any disguises or lies. He threw himself into the causes Claire cared about, not to impress her, but because he had come to appreciate the work she did and the impact it had on people's lives. James, his longtime driver and friend, supported his return, offering advice and reminding Edward of the importance of acting with integrity. As Claire watched Edward dedicate himself to the shelter and social causes with such effort, she began to see that he was not just the millionaire she had first met. The Edward standing beside her, helping the needy, was someone who wanted to change, someone who valued the work she did. One afternoon, as the two of them stood side by side organizing clothes for the homeless, Claire turned to him, more at ease than she had been in weeks. "You've been doing well, you know," she said with a shy smile. Edward looked at her, surprised and grateful for her approval. "I've had a good example," he replied, returning the smile. The tension between them had eased. While there was still much to work through, Claire began to accept that behind the lie, Edward had good intentions. The road to full forgiveness was still long, but they were making progress, step by step. However, there was still something inside Claire that resisted, a final barrier that needed to be overcome. She knew the love she had started to feel for Edward was real, but she also knew she could only fully give him her heart when she was sure he truly understood what it was like to live without privilege, like the people she helped every day. One evening, after another day of work at the shelter, Claire turned to Edward as they closed up for the night. "Edward, there's something I need to ask you," she said, her tone serious. "Of course, anything," he replied, curious. "I want you to spend a week volunteering here at the shelter like any other person," she explained. "No privileges, no money, no one treating you differently. I want you to live the routine of someone in a homeless situation, to truly understand what these people face." Edward looked at her for a moment, surprised by the request. But then he realized that this was his final chance to prove to Claire that he was willing to change. "I accept," he said, determined. "I'll do it." Claire smiled, satisfied. She knew this would be the true test of his character, and Edward knew that by the end of that week, he wouldn't be the same man anymore. Edward knew that Claire's request wasn't just a test. It was an opportunity to truly understand the reality faced by the people at Hope Shelter. Living for a week as a volunteer without the privileges of his millionaire lifestyle would be the ultimate proof of his transformation. For Claire, this gesture was crucial. If Edward genuinely wanted to connect with the work she did, he had to immerse himself fully in that world. The next morning, Edward arrived at the shelter, dressed simply, with no indication of his wealth or status. There were no more disguises, and that made him nervous. Not because he feared what he would face, but because he knew Claire would be watching, assessing his every move. Above all, he wanted to show her that he could step into the shoes of those she so tirelessly helped. James dropped him off at the shelter's entrance but didn't go inside. His silent look of approval seemed to tell Edward that he was doing the right thing. Before leaving, James gave him a supportive pat on the back, a gesture that spoke volumes. "You've got this," James said in his deep but affectionate voice. Edward nodded in response and stepped inside the shelter. Claire stood waiting at the entrance, her expression neutral, though her eyes conveyed the seriousness of the moment. "Good morning, Edward," she greeted him, already treating him like any other volunteer. "Today, we're starting with meal distribution for the homeless. I need you to help organize the lines and then serve the food. Are you ready?" "Yes," Edward replied without hesitation. The work began. Edward, accustomed to leading large corporations, now found himself in an entirely different role, dealing directly with people in extreme vulnerability. The lunch lines grew quickly, and he found himself in the middle of chaos he had never experienced. Hungry people, some irritated, others sorrowful, approached, asking for food, and Edward felt the weight of EI. As he distributed the meals, he listened to the brief, often painful stories of those passing by. Every person had a past, a life filled with challenges he could barely imagine. Some were there because of personal tragedies, others because of poor choices, and many were simply victims of an unfair system. As the day wore on, Edward's physical exhaustion grew. Organizing lines, serving food, cleaning the dining hall, it was grueling work, far different from anything he was used to. But rather than feeling drained, he felt renewed. Every smile he received, every murmured "thank you" from someone taking their plate, made him understand the importance of this work in a way he had never realized before. By the end of the first day, Edward was tired but filled with a sense of fulfillment. Claire watched him from a distance, observing his interactions with the people, noting his lack of judgment or arrogance. He seemed genuinely engaged with the cause. Perhaps, she thought, he was beginning to understand the true purpose behind the shelter's work. Throughout the week, Edward didn't just follow Claire's and the other volunteers' instructions. He began connecting with the people who used the shelter's services. One man in particular, named Thomas, who had been living on the streets for months after losing his job and home, caught Edward's attention. Despite his hardships, Thomas had a resilient spirit. One afternoon, as they distributed clothes, "You seem a bit different from the other volunteers," Thomas remarked with a wry smile. "I take it you haven't been doing this long, have you?" Edward smiled back, feeling self-conscious. "No, I started recently," Edward replied. "But I'm learning a lot. And you? How long have you been coming to the shelter?" Thomas looked at him thoughtfully before answering. "Been a few months. I had a good job for years, but a lot went wrong all at once. Lost my job, my wife left me, and before I knew it, I was on the streets. Never thought something like that could happen to me. But life has a way of surprising you, doesn't it?" Edward nodded, feeling deep empathy for the man. The conversation affected him in ways he hadn't expected. He, who had always lived a life of privilege, now stood face to face with someone who had lost everything. Thomas's experience wasn't unique. Many at the shelter had similar stories. "I just want a chance to start over," Thomas continued, his voice filled with hope. "And thanks to this shelter, I think I'm on the right path. They give me food, clothes, and most importantly, dignity." Thomas's words echoed in Edward's mind for the rest of the week. He realized that the shelter wasn't just a place for people to get food and temporary shelter. It was a place where they could reclaim their humanity and begin to rebuild their lives. As the days passed, Edward became more involved in the shelter's activities. He helped with cleaning, talked to the residents, and even started organizing small projects to improve the shelter's operations. He did all of this humbly, without expecting recognition. For the first time in his life, he was fully immersed in something bigger than himself, and it changed him a little more each day. On Friday, the last day of his challenge, Claire called him for a conversation. They sat in the empty dining hall as the sun began to set outside. "How was this week for you?" Claire asked, her gaze intense. Edward sighed, reflecting on the flood of emotions he had experienced. "It was the hardest and most rewarding week of my life," he answered honestly. "I never realized how much these people need support, or how much every small gesture matters. I always thought I understood what it meant to help, but now I see I was distant, observing from afar. Being here, living this, has made me see the world in a completely new way." Claire nodded, satisfied with his answer, but she wanted to dig deeper. "And what about us?" she asked, her voice softer now. "What have you learned about what happened between us?" Edward looked directly at her, knowing this was the most important question. "I've learned that I can't build a relationship on lies, no matter how good my intentions were," he said sincerely. I realize now that if I really want to build something with you, I have to be completely honest and respect who you are, because you're the most incredible person I've ever met, and I don't want to lose this chance. Claire smiled slightly, though her eyes still held a trace of caution. Edward, I'm not sure I can forgive you completely yet, she admitted. But seeing how much you've changed and how dedicated you've been to understanding what I do, maybe there's a chance. Just don't expect everything to go back to normal right away. He nodded, accepting her terms. He knew trust was something that had to be rebuilt over time, and he was willing to wait. I won't pressure you, Claire, he said with a look of determination. I just want you to know that I'll keep being here, doing whatever it takes, one day at a time. Claire looked at him for a moment, and for the first time she saw him as someone different. Not the millionaire Edward Monroe, nor the disguised Steve, but a man genuinely willing to change. And in that moment she felt that maybe, just maybe, they could truly have a chance to start over. The silence that followed Claire and Edward's conversation was charged with emotion. What had begun with distrust and pain was now evolving into something deeper. Claire still wasn't sure if she could fully trust Edward again, but she saw in him a renewed honesty, a man genuinely willing to change and build something real, free from the lies that had separated them in the beginning. In the days that followed, Edward continued to visit Hope Shelter, this time as himself. Edward Monroe, the millionaire heir who was using his position to make a real difference. His presence became a constant, and he fully immersed himself in the shelter's activities. However, unlike what many might have expected, he wasn't there to be seen as a savior. On the contrary, he wanted to learn, grow, and somehow make up for the mistakes of his past. The shelter residents and volunteers, initially surprised to learn of his true identity, gradually accepted his presence naturally. The man they had known as Steve was now Edward, but what mattered to them was his dedication to helping them, not his title. Over time, he felt that he was finally building something that wasn't dependent on his wealth or status. As for Claire, she found herself in a period of reflection. Despite the lingering hurt from his betrayal, she began to open herself up to the possibility of reconciliation. Edward had shown he was willing to fight for forgiveness and, above all, support her cause with genuine interest. This was something she couldn't ignore. The problem was the fear of being hurt again still held her back, but gradually, she began to see that maybe she could trust him again, even if cautiously. One afternoon, weeks after their heartfelt conversation, Claire was at the shelter when a young homeless woman named Becky came in, her eyes filled with tears. Becky had been staying at the shelter for months, and Claire had formed a special bond with her. Becky had lost her family in a car accident and had been struggling with depression and isolation ever since. Claire supported her whenever she could, offering not just medical care, but also a compassionate ear and genuine empathy. "What happened, Becky?" Claire asked, concerned, as she approached the young woman and led her to a chair. I tried to get a job, but no one wants to hire me," Becky said between sobs. "And now I'm afraid I'll lose my place at the shelter. I don't know what to do." Claire held Becky's hand tightly, trying to calm her. "Don't worry, Becky. We're going to help you," Claire reassured her, trying to soothe her fears. "You won't lose your place here, and we'll find a way to get you that job. I promise." Edward, who had overheard part of the conversation, felt compelled to help. In recent days, he had been thinking about how he could use his resources in a way that wasn't intrusive or self-centered, but rather truly impactful for the lives of those at the shelter. And at that moment, an idea began to take shape. That evening, after everyone had left, he found Claire, who was still cleaning up and organizing the shelter. He hesitated for a moment before approaching her. "Claire, I've been thinking," he began cautiously, unsure of how she would react. "I have an idea to help Becky and maybe others at the shelter too. I don't want you to think I'm trying to buy my way to forgiveness, but honestly, I just want to help." Claire, who had been focused on folding clothes, looked up at him with curiosity. "What do you have in mind?" Edward took a deep breath before explaining. "I've been thinking about starting a job training program for the people at the shelter. Something that gives them practical skills and helps them find employment. We could offer workshops, bring in specialists, and even create partnerships with local businesses to secure job placements for those who complete the program. It would give them a real chance to rebuild their lives." Claire remained silent for a moment, processing the idea. Edward's plan was ambitious, but she knew he had the resources and, more importantly, the genuine desire to help. Most importantly, the focus wasn't on him, but on the people who needed support. She thought about it for a few moments before slowly nodding. "I think it could work," she said, a small smile forming on her lips. "Actually, it might be one of the best ideas we've had for the shelter, but it's going to be a lot of work. Edward smiled, relieved that she had accepted his suggestion. Hard work doesn't scare me. I'm ready to help however I can. And so, in the weeks that followed, Edward and Claire began working together to implement the job training program at Hope Shelter. They brought in experts to teach everything from basic skills like resume writing and interview preparation to more advanced training in areas such as technology and customer service. The program quickly took shape, and the shelter's residents eagerly participated. For Claire, this was a real sign that Edward was committed not only to the shelter's work, but also to his own personal transformation. He wasn't doing it to impress her or gain visibility. He genuinely wanted to make a positive impact on the lives of those trying to start over. Becky was one of the first to benefit from the program. With the help of the training, she landed an interview at a local store, and within a short time was hired. The hope shining in her eyes was something Claire would never forget, and knowing that Edward had been part of that process made her rethink her doubts about him. One afternoon, as Becky thanked both Claire and Edward for their help, Claire approached Edward with a soft smile on her face. "You're really making a difference here," she said sincerely. Edward smiled back, feeling grateful for her words. "I'm just trying to do the right thing, Claire. And learning from you has been the best part of it all." She looked at him for a moment, and for the first time she felt the distance between them begin to close. The distrust she had carried was slowly dissolving, and she realized that Edward might have truly changed. He was no longer the man who had lied to her. He had become someone who understood the value of empathy, honesty, and hard work. That night, as they closed the shelter together, Claire looked at him and, in a nearly involuntary gesture, took his hand. "Maybe I judged you too quickly," she said, her voice low but full of meaning. Edward gently squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of her words. It was a sign that, finally, things between them were starting to shift. "I think we're both learning," he replied, looking at her with a hopeful smile. The following weeks were a true journey of rebuilding. The professional training program, envisioned by Edward, blossomed at Hope Shelter. Over time, more homeless people started participating, and partnerships with local businesses solidified, creating real job opportunities. Claire couldn't help but feel proud of the positive impact the project was having. And to her surprise, much of this progress was thanks to Edward's tireless dedication. His involvement wasn't superficial. Edward fully immersed himself in the work, talking to every person, and he kept in touch with companies in his business network to ensure opportunities were created for shelter participants. For Claire, witnessing this transformation was both inspiring and touching. One day, during a break at the shelter, Claire and Edward sat at a small outdoor table. The sun shone gently over Naperville, and a light breeze refreshed the air. It was a rare moment of tranquility amidst the shelter's demands. Claire, with a contemplative expression, looked at Edward, who was absent-minded. "You've changed a lot," she said, breaking the silence with a softness that surprised even herself. "When I first met you, you seemed lost, like you didn't know who you were. But now, you've found something here, haven't you?" Edward looked up, surprised by the tone of the conversation. He knew Claire was right. When he started this journey, he just wanted to hide from his life of privilege and find someone who loved him for who he truly was. But over time, he realized it wasn't just Claire's love he was searching for. He needed to connect with real life, with something bigger than his own ambitions and fears. "Yes, I have," he replied, looking directly into Claire's eyes. "And I think what I was searching for all along was meaning. I spent years trying to fill the void with success, money, status, but none of it really gave me what I wanted. Only here at the shelter, seeing the real impact of your work, did I realize this is what mattered." Claire smiled, but there was a tenderness in her eyes that Edward hadn't seen so clearly before. She had always believed that true love wasn't based on money or appearances, but on depth of character. And now she saw that clearly in Edward. He had made mistakes, yes, but he was willing to make amends. The wall of distrust between them was finally crumbling. "And what about us?" Claire asked, her voice a bit more hesitant. It was a topic she had avoided for weeks, but now she felt the timing was right. "I have to admit, in the beginning, I was really scared of getting hurt again. I've been through so much, Edward, and this whole situation with you made me question everything. But now, I see that maybe I've also been afraid to open up again." Edward watched her closely. He knew that despite his redemption in other areas, Claire's heart still carried scars, some of which he had caused himself. He took a deep breath, carefully choosing his words. "Claire, I know I hurt you, and I know I can't change the past," he began, his voice low but firm. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove my feelings for you are real. What I feel for you has nothing to do with the lie I created at the start. I fell in love with your strength, your kindness, and the person you are. And I want you to know that, from here on out, everything I do will be with complete transparency. No secrets, no lies. Claire looked at him, feeling the sincerity in his words. She knew he was telling the truth, but learning to trust again was a process, and she needed time. "I believe you, Edward," she finally said, "but we need to take things slow. I'm not ready to dive headfirst into a relationship right now. The wounds are still here, and I need more time to heal completely. But if you're willing to wait, I'm willing to try. One step at a time." Edward smiled, feeling a wave of relief and hope as he heard this. He knew the road to winning Claire back would be long, but he was willing to walk it with patience and dedication. "I'll wait as long as it takes," he promised, gently holding her hand across the table. "Just the fact that you're giving me this chance means the world to me." The soft touch of their hands seemed to seal a new agreement. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was the start of something new, something stronger and more real than any previous illusion. Claire allowed herself to smile, this time without the weight of the past. There was something between them worth building, even if slowly. In the following days, the program at Hope Shelter continued to grow. More homeless people began benefiting from the training, and success stories started to emerge. Becky, the young woman who had found a job thanks to the project, continued to thrive, and others began to follow the same path. The town of Naperville also began to notice the change. The shelter, once just another among many, was now becoming a center of social transformation. Edward, now fully invested in the project, also began using his position as a businessman to create initiatives that helped reduce unemployment among the homeless. He involved other companies in the area, convincing them to invest in social inclusion programs, and slowly, Edward and Claire's vision began to impact the entire community. Over time, Claire saw that Edward wasn't just a man trying to make amends for his mistakes, but someone who truly wanted to transform the world around him. And more importantly, he stood by her, respecting her pace and giving her the space she needed. Months passed, and on a quiet autumn evening, Claire and Edward were once again at the shelter, now empty after another day's work. The two sat in the small back room, seated in simple chairs, sipping hot tea, and sharing a comfortable silence. Claire looked at Edward, who seemed more relaxed than ever. She knew that the feeling that had grown between them was becoming something solid, built slowly and with mutual respect. "I don't think I ever imagined things would end up like this," she said with a light smile. "When you showed up as Steve, well, I think the last thing I expected was for this to turn into something good." Edward chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Neither did I. Honestly, Claire, I couldn't have imagined that silly disguise would lead me to find someone like you." They exchanged a look that said more than any words could. The wounds of the past were healing, and what they had now was real, solid, and above all, honest. Claire sighed, looking around the shelter, the place that had witnessed so many changes, not just in the lives of others, but in her and Edward's as well. "I think I'm ready to really try," she said, her voice calm but full of meaning. Edward looked at her, his eyes shining with a mix of surprise and happiness. "Claire, are you serious?" She nodded, smiling. "Yes, I am. I want to give us a real chance. I know things have been difficult, but I think now I'm ready to move forward. And I think, somehow, everything we went through was necessary to get us here." Edward didn't say anything. Instead, he leaned in and embraced her gently. The hug was long, silent, but full of promises. Claire felt the warmth of the gesture and knew that finally she had found someone who, despite all the mistakes, was willing to be honest, respect her boundaries, and build something true. The following months marked the beginning of a new phase in Claire and Edward's lives. Their relationship, built with patience and respect, gradually blossomed. Each day, their bond grew stronger, no longer based on illusions or disguises, but on an authentic and deep connection. Both knew that this new phase was the result of hard work and learning, but now they were ready to fully enjoy what they were building together. Hope Shelter continued to thrive as well. The professional training program Edward and Claire had created became a model of success, being replicated in other shelters around Naperville. Local businesses, inspired by the initiative, began offering more jobs to people in vulnerable situations. Homeless individuals who once saw no hope now had a new chance to rebuild their lives. Becky, the young woman who had been the program's first beneficiary, continued to work diligently at her new job and, over time, became a volunteer at the shelter, helping others rediscover themselves, just as she had been helped. Her story of overcoming challenges was an inspiration to everyone, and a symbol of the positive impact of the shelter and the project that Edward and Claire had created. With the shelter's success and their relationship solidifying, Claire and Edward began spending more time together, not only at work, but also in their personal lives. They found small moments of joy and simplicity, like walks in the park, homemade dinners, and long, peaceful conversations under Naperville's starry sky. It was a life Claire had never imagined alongside someone like Edward, but at the same time, it felt exactly where she was meant to be. One evening, after a long day at the shelter, they decided to go to Naperville's Central Square, where everything had begun. The place now held special meaning for both of them. It was there that Edward, disguised as Steve, had started his journey toward a new life. Now, hand in hand with Claire, he felt that a cycle was coming full circle. They sat on one of the benches in the square, exactly where Claire had first approached him, offering help. The fresh night air brought a sense of peace, and the silence was filled only by the soft sounds of the city around them. "It feels like it was just yesterday that we met here," Claire commented, looking at Edward with a nostalgic smile. "I never would have imagined that the scruffy, quiet man I met was actually the heir to the Monroe family." Edward chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Neither did I imagine I'd meet someone like you," he replied. "When I sat on that bench, I was trying to escape who I was. Now I realize I only found myself because you showed me there's so much more to life than I thought." Claire looked at him, her eyes shining with tenderness. "I think we both found ourselves in ways we didn't expect," she said. "And despite everything, I'm glad it happened this way." They sat in silence for a few moments, simply enjoying each other's company. Edward knew he was about to take a big step, something he had been planning for some time but always hesitated out of fear of rushing things. But in that moment, sitting next to Claire, he felt the time was right. He turned to her, gently holding her hands. "Claire," he began, his voice low but filled with emotion. "From the moment you came into my life, everything changed. I know I made mistakes, that I lied and caused a lot of pain. But at the same time, you taught me more about what truly matters in life than anyone else ever has. With you, I learned what love, compassion, and truth really are. And now I want you to know that I can't imagine my life without you." Claire looked at him, her eyes wide with the sense of what was coming. Her heart raced, but there was a calmness inside her, as if everything was finally in its right place. "What are you saying, Edward?" she asked, her voice soft but full of anticipation. Edward took a deep breath and then, with a deliberate and meaningful movement, he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. He opened it, revealing a simple but incredibly beautiful ring with a small stone that reflected the starlight. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect, exactly how Claire had always imagined. "Claire, would you do me the honor of spending the rest of your life with me?" he asked, his eyes locked on hers, his expression vulnerable, but absolutely certain of what he wanted. Claire felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had known, from the moment she began to open her heart to Edward, that this day could come. But now that it was here, real and right in front of her, she felt a wave of happiness and gratitude flood her chest. Without hesitation, she smiled, tears softly falling down her face as she answered, "Yes, Edward, of course, yes." Overcome with emotion, Edward slid the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a tight embrace. They stayed there, under the stars, wrapped in the serenity of that moment, knowing that, finally, everything was as it should be. It wasn't the end of their journeys, but the beginning of a new one, together, built on love, truth, and understanding. In the months that followed, Claire and Edward began planning the wedding. It wouldn't be an extravagant event, but rather an intimate celebration, surrounded by friends from the shelter and the people who had become an essential part of their lives. Hope Shelter, which had been the point of transformation for both of them, also became part of this new chapter in their lives. The wedding would be held there, in the space that had witnessed so many changes, joys, and challenges. On the day of the ceremony, the shelter was adorned with simple yet charming flowers, and the residents and volunteers gathered to celebrate Claire and Edward's union. Becky, now one of the shelter's main organizers, stood by their side, moved by their journey. James, Edward's loyal driver and confidant, was also present, a proud smile on his face. As Claire walked down the improvised aisle dressed in white, Edward's gaze met hers. And in that moment, everything made sense. There were no more fears, secrets, or barriers between them. What remained was true love, built with patience, honesty, and above all, respect. At the end of the ceremony, as friends and colleagues applauded, Claire and Edward embraced, knowing they were beginning a new life together. It wouldn't be a perfect life, full of luxury and glamour, but it would be a real life, grounded in everything they had learned throughout their journey. Claire looked at Edward and whispered, "Thank you for showing me that, even after pain, We can start over. Edward smiled, kissing her forehead tenderly. Thank you for teaching me what true love is, Claire. And so, with their hearts united, Claire and Edward embarked on their new journey, knowing that together they could face anything. The love that connected them was now stronger than any obstacle, and with it came days of happiness and companionship. Life in Naperville continued, but for Claire and Edward, a new chapter had begun. A chapter where love, truth, and generosity prevailed. Thank you so much for following this emotional journey to the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories like this one. And now, you can click on the links appearing on the screen to explore other amazing stories. Don't miss out. We have exciting content waiting for you almost every day.